modern novel. Today we will be talking about the social and historical background for the development of the novel. First of all, we need a definition to understand what the novel is, what it is about. We need a definition. And it's always good when you give definitions, when we give definitions, it's always good to give a definition from an expert, somebody who has some kind of expertise in the field. So, for example, here I will give you the definition of literary critic M.H. Abrams. He defines the novel. He says the term novel is now applied to a great variety of writings that have in common only the attributes of being extended works of fiction written in prose. Its magnitude permits a greater variety of characters, greater complications of plot or plots, ampler development of milieu, and more sustained exploration of character and motives than do the shorter, more concentrated modes. Basically what he says is that the term novel is now applied to a great variety of writing. A lot of types of writings are called novel, and what they have in common, these writings, are the following things. They are extended works of fiction. They're long works of fiction, and they're written in prose. That's all they have in common. Their magnitude, the fact that they're long works of writing, their magnitude permits, it allows a greater variety of characters. So in the short story, for example, the short story cannot deal with like too many characters. Usually there's only one or two in a short story. The novel can afford and can allow itself, because it has a longer space, it has space to deal with a larger variety of characters, 5, 6, 10, or even more. And the length, the magnitude of the novel also allows greater complication of plot or plots, and bigger development of an exposition of the milieu. And it allows also, because it's long, it allows a more sustained exploration of character and motives than do the shorter, more concentrated modes of literature, like the short story. So this is in a way, if you want, this is an expert definition of the novel. What you notice, first of all, is that it's not very precise, because it says that the word novel is applied to a large number of writings that have in common the fact that they are long, that they are fiction, and that they are in prose. So, to understand how the novel emerged, some very important points need to be said. The emergence of the novel was made possible by a number of factors, but the most important are two. The first factor is the development of printing, the printing press, which enabled mass production of reading material. In the old days, before there was printing, books needed to be written in manuscripts, which takes time, and they're expensive to sell, they're expensive to buy, and you can produce large amount of copies. But with the printing press it changes, because now you have a machine that can type fast and can produce huge quantities of copies that can be sold cheaply, and therefore average individuals can afford to buy copies of books, whereas before books were things that only rich people or aristocrats could afford to have. So the development of printing, the printing press, is very important for the emergence of the novel. And the second thing is the development of a middle class, or sometimes it's called a middle station, which have the leisure, the free time and the leisure to read, to buy books and read. In the past, in the 14th, 15th centuries, in the Renaissance, for example, there was no middle class. There were aristocrats and serfs. Serfs were extremely poor people that didn't have any money and just served the aristocrats. So aristocrats had the opportunity and the wealth and the money and the time to buy books and read books. Now there is a middle class in the 17th and 18th century for a number of reasons. We'll talk about them in a minute. There is a middle class that emerges. They're not aristocrats, but they're not serfs either. They're in the middle. That's why they're called the middle class or the middle station. And these people now, they're not rich, they're not extremely rich, but they have a little bit of money and they can afford to buy books that now are cheaper than they used to be in the Renaissance, and they have some time to spend, to have a hobby, for example, to read books and novels as a hobby. As a result of this, of the development of the printing press and the development of the middle class, the result is that there develops in Europe a popular taste in literature. In the Renaissance, there is no such thing as a popular taste. Taste is something that aristocrats have. They're the ones who have money and have access to books and manuscripts, and they can hone their taste. They can build and take care of their taste and improve it, right? Poor people don't have a taste in literature because they don't read literature. So now that there is a printing press and books cost less, right? They're cheaper and people can afford to buy them, at least the middle class, they can afford to buy them. And more average people from the middle class can read and buy books. So there develops a popular taste, right? A popular taste. When the novel appeared in the 18th century, it was not considered a literary genre. People in academia or in universities in the 18th century did not consider the novel a literary genre. It was a popular taste. This is what, the new middle class, who are not, rich, who don't have a great education, they're just literate. They can read and write, but they're not well educated. They can't read Greek or Latin or things like that. So the novel was just a popular taste. We take Daniel Defoe, for example, who is considered to be the grandfather of the novel. Daniel Defoe was a merchant. He was a literary merchant, and he took advantage of an emerging market and an emerging reading public. There is a reading public now, people who can afford to buy books, so he wanted to sell them books. Defoe was more concerned with pleasing the taste of this public, this new middle-class public, the average reader. He was not concerned with pleasing the tastes of the critics or the educated aristocrats. And he referred, that's Daniel Defoe, he referred to his audience, to his readers, as honest, meaning, ignorant people. Honest, meaning, ignorant persons, sorry. Of course, this development of a printing press, a reading public, a middle class, writers like Daniel Defoe, of course it will have an impact on language, on the English language precisely. So the English language now will develop in a specific way. Let me explain how. Defoe did not write his first novel until he was 59. Until then, he was a journalist and a political pamphleteer. He wrote political pamphlets and he was a journalist. And his style in writing novels is influenced by journalism. So when you read Defoe's novels, it feels like you're reading journalism. journalism is easier to read, it's simpler, it doesn't use complicated imagery, it uses simple, matter-of-fact, everyday life words. So, and of course, this influences the English language, because now the English language is developing a written form that's now easy to read, accessible to average people, and it doesn't have the complex poetic structures that only very educated people can understand. It's now a language that has rules, that's pretty good language. It's a written language, but it's also accessible to average Englishmen and Englishwomen. So the fact that the first writers of the novel were journalists or political pamphleteers reflected on the development of the novel and on the development of the English language. Other factors that also influenced language was the desire to keep language close to the speech of craftsmen and artisans and merchants, because these people now have become the new economic and financial agents of England. Now that England has colonies in America, England controls the international slave trade, England also has factories, so the people who now drive the economy in England are not landowners or feudals or aristocrats, it's artisans, it's craftsmen and merchants. And because they're the ones who drive the English economy, there is a desire to keep language close to their speech, to the way they speak, right? So this is also another thing that contributed to the development of the English language. Of course, this happens because this is a time in the 16th and 17th century. It's a time of worldwide travels. Europeans are exploring the planet in every direction. They establish colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean. And of course, we have the international slave trade, which was the biggest trade on earth. It was the biggest body of trade on earth. And of course, we have industrialization. All of these factors generate huge wealth for England, for France, for Spain, for Holland at the time. Europe, especially England, is now in control of the international trade routes. Most of the international trade routes are now controlled by European states, especially England. And now European states own the bulk of the international trade, the biggest share of the international trade. So these new economic realities produce a middle class in England. There is now a class of people. Their parents used to be serfs, but they made some money. They didn't have to stay as serfs like their parents. They traveled to America or invested in cotton or invested in slavery or tobacco or in factories and made some money and have become a middle class. They now, their children can be educated, can be sent to schools and at least become literate. Perhaps they can't send them to like very expensive schools like Oxford and Cambridge, but they can educate them at least to be literate, at least in the first centuries. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, prose is still not recognized as a literary form. Literary forms are recognized to be poetry and drama, but prose is still seen as just the language of average people. Only Greek and Latin and English verse were considered high culture, English prose was what lower or middle class people read and wrote. Excuse me. The economic wealth created in the 18th century, a middle class that has a good income and has some time off, some leisure time. They cannot read Greek or Latin or formal literature like dramas and tragedies and stuff, but they can read simple stories, and simple stories written in simple prose. So the first novels that were published, they were published as serial stories in newspapers. They included travel stories published in episodes telling the English public of adventures in faraway lands. So these are people who would go and invest. For example, they travel to America or to work in colonies, and they come back and they write stories about their travels and publish them in the newspapers, and they tell the English public about these faraway lands, about these faraway people, their customs, their strange habits, and so on and so forth. So the establishment of colonies and worldwide travels and international trade made people in England also curious about these new lands. Now people in England, they want to know what kind of people live in America, what kind of people live in the Caribbean, what's their customs, what strange things do they do. And this is how stories began to be published in newspapers in prose about travel adventures in exotic and faraway lands. These stories were a huge success, and people began to buy them and read them, of course, in the newspaper in the beginning. The popularity of these travel stories made publishers realize that there was a market. Some few publishers realized, oh my God, people are buying these stories. There is a market. I can invest here. And this is how novels in book format began to be published. So instead of publishing them as episodes in newspapers, they started publishing them as novels. The impact of printing is also very important. It affected the way literature was produced and the way it was circulated. Literature was no more a public act. Before printing, literature, if you hear a poem, most likely you would hear it from the poet himself in a public event. Most of the time in a court of a prince or a duchess or a duke or a king or something. So when you hear the poetry or you watch the play, most of the time you watch that play being performed. And when you hear poetry, most of the time you hear it from the poet himself. You don't read it in manuscript because they were expensive and very few. But literature now is a book. Because of printing, literature now is a book that is read by a reader in the comfort of his room or his home, but most of the time in isolation, even if you're sitting with other people, but the reading exercise, you're reading alone. It's an isolated exercise. So this has affected the production of literature. The writer now writes not for a public, for public event. The writer doesn't write things to be read in public, but he writes for a reader, for an individual reader who will sit on his own and read from the page, right? And it also affects how literature is circulated. It doesn't circulate anymore in courts and public readings and public performances in theaters. Now it circulates in books that are bought by individuals and read in isolation by individuals. Still though, the 18th century gives us, and printing of course, gives us a new type of places, venues where literature circulates, places like bookshops, coffee houses, salons, and reading rooms where people gathered simply to read and discuss literature. So this is these are new places now that have become common for people to go and read and discuss literature. So this is briefly the socio-historical background that led to the development of the novel. Of course, it's important to remember that it's in prose. Prose was not considered a literary form. The novel was not considered a literary form. It developed because a middle class developed in the English and European society. The new economic realities allowed this middle class to have some money now, and allowed it can afford to buy books and read books. And also the new economic realities created the need for schools and for people who are literate, who can read and write, because factories need to be operated by people who can read and write, and international commerce needs people who at least can read and write. So this is the time when English grammar schools were built, and there is the first generations of laymen, commoners, everyday type of people who are educated and can read and write and can buy books and can write novels and can write stories, which then are distributed, stories about exotic places and faraway lands. And this is how a public was created, and publishers realized that there is a market there that they can exploit, and they started publishing novels in book format. I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh.